Okay, so hi, my name is Eudes, and I'm a technical lead for Clarity at VMware. And today I'm going to talk about developer experience, not specifically my developer experience, but how to write reusable components that don't make the developers using them just want to throw their laptop out the window. Because it's an important part, right? End user experience matters, but people also integrate your components, and you don't want to make their life living hell. So yeah, let's just jump right in and say you have a little component that you wrote. So it's a carousel component, displays a list of images, and you can slide left or right to see all the images. For some reason, every time you show that, everyone seems to love it, so you assume the component is great and you want to share it with the world. And so just very quickly, let's look at what the code might look like for you. So you just have a previous button, a next button, a list of images that you iterate over, and you put this in a mask that will handle the hiding, the ones that are not visible right now, maybe the sliding, all that. Here, the images, I get them from some random service that my component uses. For the sake of simplicity here, I didn't put the code for the previous method, the next method, the animations, all that doesn't really matter for our case. Just the overall structure of what the component looks like is what is important here. So so we're going to convert this component step by step into a reusable component. And before I do this, I'm going to go over quickly what I think developers look for. And since the room is full of developers, please correct me if I'm wrong at the end. But yeah, so when you use a third-party component, and when I say third-party, it might just be a custom component your company wrote somewhere for you to reuse in different projects. But when you use a third-party component, you want it to be flexible enough to do everything you want it to do. You don't get to pick what your component needs to do. You get project managers and designers and marketing, and everyone tells you what you should do, so you need the component to be able to do it. Another thing is people integrating it want to integrate it quickly. If I need 1,000 lines of code and 10 hours of integration for just a button, then this is going to be a problem. So as easy to integrate as possible. And finally, this one is a little bit different, and maybe everyone doesn't agree with this one. But you want the components API to be as familiar in whatever tool or framework you're using as possible. Because a familiar API that you can understand by just reading the component quickly is going to be much better than 20 pages of documentation that you have to come through to find the one option you need. Okay? So every time we're going to move one step forward with the reusable component, I'm going to try and say, OK, this is for flexibility. This is to be easy to integrate. This is for familiarity. And those things. So first try is a pretty obvious one. Instead of hard coding our list of images, we just receive it as an input, and we just iterate over the list of images that the consumers gave us. So pretty straightforward. This little icon means this is on my side. This is my reusable component. This little icon, this little emoji means this is what the consumer is going to do when they integrate my components. Okay? So here integration is pretty straightforward. They just use my components and give me the input of the images. This is fantastic. You ship it. It's easy to use. And then within hours of shipping this, you get questions like, hey, how do I make my image a link? Or I want to add a button to each image at the top right. Or this is not accessible. There's no title on the images, and I need titles on them. So how do I do this? And so you're going to add a title property, and you're going to add a link property, and you're going to add a button property, and then a button position property. And after a month, you're just going to be pulling your hair out trying to figure out how you can maintain this mess. So we can make this more flexible in one change. Instead of just receiving the list of images, we use content projection. Okay? So content projection, I just put my ng content inside of the mask, and anything you put inside of the carousel components will go inside of the mask. No more input for the images anymore. When I do this, people use it like this. They iterate themselves over their own images. They get to add links, titles, buttons, whatever they want, and they just put it inside of the carousel component, and it will work fine. So there you go. One change, flexibility for people to use to do anything they want with their images, add any attributes, add any buttons, links, anything they want. So this is good. This is much better, much more flexible than before. So you ship that. And then a day later, you get people asking, hey, how do I make one image in particular visible right now? Or how do I know which image is currently displayed? Or I want to react when the user clicks on previous or next. How do I do this? So Once again, not flexible enough for everyone's use cases. They're going to have some tweaks, and they want hooks for them to customize the component's behavior. So typically in Angular, what you do for this is you use inputs and outputs. So inputs we saw, they're pretty straightforward. And I just realized from now on, I'm going to try and switch the other way. I'm going to talk about what we want people to do and then show how I can write my component for them to do this, rather than write my component and then showing how they can use it. I think this is a much better way to design and architect a reusable component. Think how you want people to use it and then write it in that way. Developer experience first. So here, you just provide a current index input. So they're just going to add their current index to the carousel. And the way to do this is just an input, as we saw. Here, I kind of want to make an exception, because it's an input where if you receive it at any time, you're going to want to perform an operation. If at any point in the application tells you, hey, the current index is now 3, it's not just, oh, I changed my current index. You have to perform the operation, animate, make it move. So for this, I just wanted to showcase a couple examples of how to do this. The first one is the simpler one. You just put the input on the setter, which means you can have any kind of logic you want in that setter to perform your operation immediately as you receive the input. The other version is more robust and scalable, better for larger changes, but it's just more verbose. You just use ng on changes, and so you can check whether the current index has changed, and if it has, you're going to perform your operation. Okay? I'm sorry, this is going really fast. Gets worse, but I'm very happy to answer questions at the end. Yeah, so hopefully that works. So next, we have the output. So we said, oh, I can dynamically say the third image is going to be displayed, but now I want to react. You know, people said I want to react to the user clicking next or previous or something like this. So I've seen this a couple times where you give an input that has a callback, and you have the reusable component just call the function whenever next is clicked. The problem with this is it's not really Angular. Angular has another structure for this, which is outputs. So by using an output, and this is where we talk about this is the familiar part. The first one is not necessarily bad. It's just very React, for instance, where you give the callbacks, and then the application is going to call those functions. The second one is an output where you call the function whenever the output is emitted. The second one is much clearer for someone who just finished the tour of heroes. They understand immediately, oh, that's an output. I know what to do with this. Okay? So how do we do a next output? You just put an output annotation on the next property. You make that property an event emitter, which is an object that Angular provides. And once you have this, you just can use the emit method on the event emitter. We're having technical issues. That's good. You just kill the emit method on the event emitter, and it will emit the output. So pretty straightforward. Most of you might already know all this. Now we're getting into the part where you don't necessarily know everything. So right now, our component, the way you use it, looks like this. I have a carousel, I have an input for the index, and I have two outputs, one for next, one for previous. We're flexible again. People can do anything they want, and they can hook into different actions to do custom behavior. Anymore, it's getting pretty painful to write every time. So the thing here is we have an input, and we have two outputs that are pretty much tied together. When a user clicks next, well, my current index is going to change. So when you have this, what you want to do is simply offer two-way binding. Once again, we're going back to something easy to integrate and familiar. If you just finished the tour of heroes, this is the same syntax as, say, ng model. So you know that, you know what two-way binding does. So here, when the user clicks next or previous, well, the current property for the application will be updated, and they can react to that any way they want. Okay? So much easier, and it does the same thing. So this is the part where you might not know. How do you do a two-way binding? Well, two-way binding is just syntactic sugar. So if I have an X two-way binding, Angular just takes that and splits it into an X input and an X change output, where what you do on the output is just assign the event to your property. Okay, so this is just syntactic sugar. When you compile down Angular, this is what it does, which means in our case, to do a two-way binding, you just need a current index input and a current index change output. Be careful, no typos. This is naming conventions, so you have to respect this. It's changed, not changed with a D. So you have to respect this naming convention, but if you do, you get two-way binding for free, and it's much easier for everyone to integrate. Here, because it's two-way binding, instead of just emitting nothing, we're going to have to emit, well, the current index every time we emit the output. So for this, event emitter has a type parameter now, which is, oh, I'm going to emit numbers. And when I emit, I just give the number of the current index, and I'm good to go. OK, so this is how you do two-way binding. So right now, our component to integrate looks like this. OK, this is starting to look more serious. It's not very hard to implement. If I read this, I understand what it does. I control the images myself. I can do anything I want. So far, so good. So no problem with this. And if you ship that, I mean, I'm going to give you a ship it on GitHub, and it's good to go. Now, we can go a little bit further. The problem here is all the images are instantiated and loaded immediately when you use this component. So imagine someone tries to do this. Do you know how many JavaScript frameworks and JavaScript-related frameworks there are out there? You're going to crash your browser if you do this. So you can't possibly instantiate all of them, and you just want the visible images to be loaded. So how do we do this? There's several solutions, and this is where it's going to go really fast, and I'm hoping you can follow, and please, sorry if I go too fast. So the first one that I've seen a couple times, so those are actual APIs from existing carousel components in the wild. The first one is you use this hash carousel on the carousel element. You give an input of the list of objects you want to iterate over in the carousel to the carousel component. You use this template reference variable, the hash, to grab the carousel component instance, and then you iterate yourself with ng4 over carousel.visible, which is the property of the three visible frameworks right now, the three visible items. OK, this was just the way I explained it shows there's a problem. Template reference variables are an advanced feature. If someone just finished the tour of heroes, they have no idea what they are. So they can't integrate your component. And on top of that, this is just pushing internal wiring to the consumer, where they just have to grab the component and pass the data to some other piece of your component. It's a bit of a mess. So that one is definitely a no. Now, another version, and this is the kind of cleaner version, is to use templates or template refs. So I can't really go into detail as to why template refs allow you to only instantiate the variables you need right now. But the idea is that template ref is a stamp. A template is a stamp. So if I give you a template, I'm giving you a stamp for you to produce as many images as you want. And the point is the carousel is only going to produce the three that are currently visible. And as you slide, it's going to produce more and destroy the previous ones. So the way this works is you give, once again, your list of objects to the carousel, and then a template. And the carousel is going to instantiate that template for the three currently visible items. Now, you can notice this let framework. It's the way for you to grab the instance that is currently used as the context for the template reference and be able to access it to use framework.logo and framework.name. Now, once again, if you didn't understand what I just said about template local variables, it's because it's an advanced features, and 90% of you haven't had to use this ever. So advanced feature, if you put this as part of your component API, people are just going to copy-paste it and not necessarily understand what they're doing. So you're not doing them any favors. And on top of that, now I have an extra ng template wrapper, and nobody likes extra wrappers, right? HTML is already going to be deep enough every single time. I don't want to have ng templates nested in every level. So again, better but not great. So finally, what if we did this? What if instead of just using ng4, what if we provided the consumer our custom directive, myVisible, that just iterates over the currently visible objects? So now I don't need to give the list of items to the carousel anymore. I give it to the directive, and the directive receives a list of 100 items and only iterates over the currently visible 3. As the user slides, it iterates over 3 different items every time. This is something that it's the exact same syntax as ng4. If I read this right after the tour of heroes, even if I don't know the components, if I don't know what this myVisible directive does, I can pretty much understand what's happening, and I have a good idea. If I join an existing app, I know what's going to happen here, more or less. So this is much better, and a beginner Angular user can understand what they're doing. So how do we do this? The problem is it's going to be harder on outside. So bear with me. A structural directive is syntactic sugar for this horrible thing over there, which is you put the element on which you have the structural directive inside of an ng template, and then you add a template local variable, and then you add your directive, and then you can, on top of that, have an x of input that takes the second part of your let a of b. What does that mean in our specific case? Well, if you have your myVisible directive, you just declare an attribute directive like you would do for any other directive. And because it's used as a structural directive, you can inject a template ref in there. Please ignore the other arguments for template refs. You can inject a template ref. So you have your template to stamp. And on top of that, the myVisible of input is the one that receives the full list of items. So here, with my directive, it's just 2 lines. I have my template, and I have my list of all items I want to iterate over in my carousel. Next step, this is the part that gets a bit messy, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to use the simplest version that I can do for this. So how do I make my carousel use this myVisible directive? I am just going to use content child. So visible directive is inside of the carousel component. So I'm going to grab it with @contentChild. So I have the instance of my directive, which, remember, has a template. Has a template and has a list of all items that I want to iterate on. So from this, I can generate a list of 3 currently visible items. Okay, and in my component, I keep everything else. The inside, instead of being projected, ng content, I now use an ng4. I iterate only over the visible elements. And this is the trick. ng4 lets you overwrite the template it's going to use and say, hey, instead of using whatever I'm writing in my ng4, use this template that someone else gave me. Okay? Really quick, if you have questions about this, I'm very happy to answer it after. I'm just showing it is possible because I really want you to understand it leads you to this kind of API, which is infinitely better for people to use. If you're interested in this, just go over the slides again once I upload them somewhere, or come ask me questions, and I'm happy to answer them. So now, yeah, we have myVisible iterator that you put in the carousel. You have even the two-way binding if you want to control what's currently visible or not. If I'm looking at this and I try this, if you show it to a beginner in Angular, even if they don't know the component, they have a pretty good idea of what's happening. They could explain to me, oh yeah, you're iterating over the frameworks and showing the visible ones, and I can control what the current index is. So this is good, even better than the previous version. Once again, ship it if you have it. Now, if you want to go the extra mile, just a tiny bit further, and this is very easy and doesn't cost you much to do. It's no one likes working with indices. I don't know if you do, but every single time I'm receiving indices from a third-party component, I have to go back to my model, find which object it was. It's a nightmare. So what you really want to do is more like what ngModel does, which is bind to the actual current item, the actual current object, the one that has a logo and title and all that. So to do this, it's TypeScript. It's not Angular. You just need type parameters absolutely everywhere, on your component, on your directive, to make sure whatever type of objects you receive from the app is the one you're going to emit in your output. So type parameters everywhere on your directive and your component. Your visible items are now of that same type. Your current item is of that type. The event emitter emits that type. And when you emit the actual object. And that's all you needed to do. When you have this, you have the binding on current, and you get your actual object with methods like this picture method or titles or anything you want. And it's a much easier API than the ones with template local variables and template reference variables. So thank you for your time. Maybe I have time for questions, but probably, yeah. So I'm happy to answer questions. I'm sorry this went so fast on the last example. Yeah, you have a mic.
Early on, you made is this on? Not on?
No, he can just repeat the question.
I can repeat the question.
You said that set was not as robust as ng on changes. I just wanted to
Yes.
follow up on that to understand your thoughts on
So
changes more robust.
So
So please repeat the question.
So yeah, I'm going to repeat the question. So the question is, why is ng on changes here more robust than the setter? So the main reason is lifecycle issues. When the setter is used, Angular will call it as soon as the change detection on the parent runs, which means if you have several inputs that you need to react to, then they're going to be called one by one, and you don't know the order. It's not exactly random. It might be linked to the order in which they were written as attributes in the HTML of the parent component, something like that. So you can't rely on it. So you would constantly be checking whether one is set before the other. And because of this, the ng on changes lets you check all changes at once they're done. Same thing. When this is called before even ng on init on initialization. Okay, so you might not even have anything ready. You might not have gotten your data set from the service. You might not have anything ready yet. Whereas ng on changes is going to happen a tiny bit later, which lets you prepare and do the setup before you actually react to the input. Does that answer your question?
One more question, maybe?
Far over there.
There is a question in the back. Yes. Well, I don't know if this is audible or not, but my question was very simple. I was just wondering if the contents of this presentation are available anywhere on GitHub.
No, I started preparing a stack blitz. Oh, sorry. The question is this somewhere on GitHub so that you can try it out? I started preparing a stack blitz. It was a bit of a mess trying to have each step of our improvement in the stack blitz. So I haven't cleaned it up yet. I might just go ahead and submit the last version, the final version, on either GitHub or stack blitz, in which case I can share it on the Meetup link, I guess.